She found it on the feed, as one finds an unattended photograph, by accident, and then with the stubborn curiosity that refused to let it go. A small square of glass on a phone, the frame so tight that the corridor beyond it was only suggestion. 2 planes of plaster, a strip of amber light seeping like resin between them, and a figure as thin and still as a seam. When she rewound it, the grain softened into a suggestion of breathing. When she sped it up, the figure remained a vertical hush. For a woman whose life had been built on being seen, the sight of someone who simply stood and watched felt, at first, like an absence she could catalogue. Celeste Moraro had cultivated an economy of publicness, polished hands, curated laughter, the faint, practiced tilt to her head that read well in thumbnails. Cameras made her a ledger of moments, outfits, dinners, the short bursts of intimacy she traded for attention. She knew how to be recognized on escalators and in gallery foyers. She knew, too, the underside of that recognition. The way applause could be measured into loneliness, how the crowd's desire to claim a story flattened it into readable contours. The feed that showed the seam did not tokenize her. It offered a different kind of accounting, one that kept rather than consumed, and the difference felt dangerous in the slow way of things that change the grammar of a life. The clip was nothing like a cinematic reveal. It had the accidental mercy of poor lighting. The amber band came from a lamp beyond the shot. The plaster bore the dull fingerprints of an old building. Dust moved in the frame as if rehearsed. The figure was tall, thinner than any coat rack, taller than most doors. It did not turn, did not make a gesture that would translate into motive. It simply occupied the seam between shadow and light. It kept that border as if it were what it had been assigned. She rewound it until the small speaker made that tinny, patient stutter that happens when memory is asked to repeat. Each time the seam resolved and broke down. A shadow, a gutter, a coat draped badly over something. Then, after she watched it 3, 7, 12 times, there came the moment when the video ceased to be evidence and began to feel like invitation. She paused, as if the phone might be listening. The room around her, the scented candles she had lit for an appearance, the soft hum of the city outside, felt less like supporting set and more like an apparatus for paying attention. The feed's metadata was modest, a user she did not know, a timestamp that said nothing, a frayed line of numbers, a caption that read like an afterthought. The thumbnail had already been cut and recut across other accounts by the time she noticed. The clip propagated because everyone was hungry for tidy narratives, for a thing to pin their curiosity on and call it complete. They wanted label, which is to say they wanted an ending. The seam refused to be wrapped in a headline. She was not alone in returning to it. Screenshots proliferated, cropped closer, shifted lighter, run through filters that made the grain look antiquated. Anonymous accounts argued about the identity of the corridor, a backstage passage, a neglected alley, a hallway in a condominium whose name changed depending on which rumor was in season. Someone claimed it was a setup. Someone else suggested a marketing stunt. A thread of skeptical accounts pointed out the pixelation, look at the compression artifacts, and treated the piece like a problem to be solved. In comment sections, people performed ownership with the same appetite as a museum crowd. We will name it, we will explain it, we will file it away. But the clip accumulated other things besides captions. A taxi driver tweeted a grainy reflection in a rear window, catching the seam not as a central subject, but as a murmuring edge of the city. A delivery camera, designed to be unnoticed, picked up a vertical shadow that lingered on a stairwell landing for the duration of a slip of footage. The courier apologized in a text message to a customer who never opened it. A thrift shop worker found a gown folded among linens, an expensive fabric in a box marked returns, and snapped a photo of a stain that didn't read like blood or coffee, but like something that had been pressed and kept. Each fragment suggested proximity, as if the seam liked to sit where public routes narrowed and attention thinned. Celeste collected these fragments with the methodical obsession of a woman trained to curate narratives. She printed the delivery camera stills and spread them across her dressing room table like a board of evidence. She cut newspaper clippings. One column called it the Amber Shadow, another declared it a phantom or a PR, and she placed them beside the gown photograph. To anyone watching from outside, these were the gestures of a person who had made an odd hobby of chasing mystery for clicks. To her, it was a necessary countermapping to the world that only ever recorded the front of things. There was an early moment, the kind that can be reread as pivot, when she visited a rented archive, a municipal reading room whose windows looked out onto a back street that always smelled faintly of lemon rind and old dust. The librarian, a small woman with glasses on a chain, did not judge the documents she brought out. She listened to the way Celeste described the seam, not as an act, but as a presence that kept. In the leather light of that room, Celeste learned the word threshold had becomings beyond architectural jargon. Thresholds could be guardians and registers. There were old entries about doors that kept names, about seam keepers who were less interested in enforcing passage than in recording the passing. "You'll find most accounts are metaphors," the librarian said, and she pushed a stack of mimeographed pages towards Celeste with the casual authority of someone who had learned how to keep stories from becoming spectacles. But sometimes a place will retain the pattern of attention that passed through it. They call it keeping. Celeste left with printouts that smelled of copier ink and the feeling that she had stepped into a different ledger. The librarian's elliptical answers did not comfort her. They widened the question. What did it mean to be kept? For a woman whose publicness had always meant display, the idea of being kept discreetly entirely was at once attractive and alarming. Marlowe was the next practical contact. He had the slow, granular manner of someone who had spent decades backstage. The way he said "wings" like a prayer, the small humility with which he spoke of spotlights and planks. Marlowe had been a stagehand since before Celeste's grandmother was young, which lent his voice a ledger of other bad weather. Even so, he did not sound theatrical when he told Celeste about a corridor where the light never quite matched the lamps. "It's not that it's haunted in the way people like to imagine," he said, unspooling a cigarette with hands that had held ropes and nails and the thin satin hands of many a costume. "It just keeps. People leave things there, and they turn up later with a different smell. Once, a trumpet I thought was stolen turned up on the other side of a wall. The instrument didn't play the same after. That's keeping, isn't it? Not taking, not breaking, but holding." He said the word without menacing flourish. The way he told it made the idea feel like a stage direction you weren't meant to read aloud, but could not help glancing at when the script went quiet. When Celeste asked for permission to see the corridor, Marlowe's answer was not immediate. The theater had 1,000 liabilities, union rules, insurance, the delicate pride of an old building that did not care for celebrity. But he was curious too, and curiosity is a small, inexorable ally. He gave her a time, after a late rehearsal when the house lights would be down and the wings would be crowded with the soft mechanics of set change. He warned her about the dust. He said, "You'll feel like the seam is listening, don't be surprised." To approach the theater late at night was to relearn the city as an organism that breathes in different tempos. The marquee lights were already dimmed, but the amber glow from alley lamps pooled around the doors like offered coins. The doorman who recognized her asked nothing. Recognition in these parts was a currency paid out in head nods. Inside, the smell of resin and powdered glue stitched through the air with a fidelity to the work of many hands. The stage was an absence in which other things could be made manifest. Backstage corridors folded into their own map-making, a thin space between walls where light gathered like a reluctant thought. Her assistant texted her updates from home, small, pragmatic messages that read as if from another life. The assistant had suggested a PR narrative, had drafted a post that would neutralize speculation by making it a performance. Celeste kept these drafts in a folder she never opened. She felt more like a witness than a subject, and she did not know whether to monetize that witness. She did not want to own it. She wanted to understand whether something could keep what it saw without converting it into product. The theater's seam was less theatrical than she had imagined. It was a vertical fissure in the plaster behind a service door, a narrow throat of light that slivered through the building's old skin. The amber was not stage light. It was an older bulb somewhere down a service stair, yellowed and persistent. When she pressed her palm to the cool plaster beside it, she felt a slight warmth, as if the wall itself had been rubbing a memory between its layers. The seam held a tension in the way an old pocket holds the shape of a hand that no longer slips inside. She did not speak at first. The wings smelled of tar and varnish and the faint sweetness of someone else's perfume. The theater made a silence that was not empty but populated with the deferred noise of 1,000 evenings. Applause stored like rainwater, laughter curled in the soffits, and the small, exhausted conversation of industry. Marlowe moved like someone who had internalized the building's pace, and when he stood with her at the seam, he did not ask her to perform anything. He simply shared the observation of someone who had watched the building age around its own habits. "People come through here expecting a story," Marlowe said. "They want a villain, an explanation. Most of them leave with a rumor. The thing about rumors is they fit into people's pockets. Keeps, though, don't need pockets." Celeste heard in his phrasing the exact difference she had been feeling. Rumor is tidy. Keeping is not. To be kept was to be preserved with a privacy that made her feel both relieved and bereft, not the kind of attention she could monetize. To be kept meant to be remembered whole and quiet, in a ledger invisible to the public's appetite for tidy arcs. When the first witness accounts began to surface in earnest, they read like the kinds of testimonies people make to get free of their proximity. A doorman said she had seen a woman who resembled Celeste walking quickly away from a service door the night before. A commuter swore he had glimpsed a thin silhouette standing between buildings at dawn. An editing assistant leaked a text message in which an anonymous person claimed the clip was optical fluke, nothing more. The city loved to balance itself by offering multiple plausible narratives, as if equilibrium could be achieved by having many explanations. Meanwhile, the footage multiplied into other footnotes. Someone posted a clip from a hallway mirror that showed the seam as a dark tooth in the reflection. Another user uploaded a shaky vertical video taken from a cab that caught a gleaming strip of amber between two buildings, like candlelight in a slot. The images converged not so much to clarify as to thicken the atmosphere. The seam had a habit of appearing where reflection gathered. Mirrors, glass and water were where it liked to make itself known, as if remembrance preferred surfaces that could hold duplicates. She began to sleep with a notebook under her pillow, a habit she had picked up in quieter months when she liked to sort the day into legible lines. In the mornings, she would find fragments of thought that read like excavation. A phrase about attention as ledger. An image of a hand leaving an imprint on plaster, a note that read only, keeps not consumes. She taped these scraps to the inside of a vanity drawer like talismans against being reduced to spectacle. A thin file of messages arrived from people who had never spoken to her before. Some offered empathy, some offered conspiracy. The most persistent ones were from viewers who confessed to rewinding the same clip, who had watched the muted vertical for minutes at a time as though the figure might rearrange itself into clarity. "I watched it at 3 a.m. and I swear it moved," one said. Another wrote, "You should stage this. It's perfect content." Celeste read them all with a detached intimacy, the way one might read letters from a stranger that are not meant to be answered. A fashion editor sent a column that treated her near obsession as a narrative beat to be capitalized on, an influencer befriended by a myth. An amateur folklorist on an academic forum sent her a paper on threshold figures in urban myths, how ancient motifs adapt to electric cityscapes. The same motif appeared in different tongues. The seam as seamstress, the seam as keeper, the seam as place where the world stores what the city will not allow on its public shelves. Each source offered the potential for certitude, but it always felt like a will-o'-the-wisp. The more she tried to pin it down, the more the seam seemed to move just beyond the point of capture. She began to plan small experiments. She scheduled a night to stand where the seam had been filmed and to take her phone out of focus to see whether human attention would elicit a pattern. She brought along a small LED light and pointed it at plaster to test the behavior of shadow. In the dark of the corridor, she held the phone with two hands and recorded until her thumbs cramped. The footage looked like a rehearsal, a vertical slice of the world, an amber fade, a small, patient grain. Nothing in the recording explained the uncanny quality that had seized her in private. Nothing in the recording convinced anyone else to quit their day job and believe. The public appetite for tidy endings, however, grew louder. Headlines multiplied. Influencer vanishes after mysterious video, PR stunt or paranormal. They assumed motions and motivations that were not hers. Some columnists speculated on the monetary benefit of disappearance. Others invoked the language of tragedy. A legal analyst argued about liability. A gossip blog published a purported leaked oil-stained receipt from a boutique sale she had last attended. The city, with its appetite for pattern, drafted a dozen ways to domesticate the seam. Celeste watched these assertions like a person watching dominoes set by strangers, detached, mildly disgusted, but also aware that even detritus could be meaningful. She had no desire to stage a disappearance. She had no desire to comprise her story into the tidy forms the city offered. She wanted a ledger that recorded differently, one that did not require public consumption to validate memory. There were moments when the seam felt to her less like a physical object and more like a method of attention. Once, on a windless morning, she found herself staring into a shop window where mannequins stood presiding over a sale. She saw in the polished glass the faint vertical of the seam, and for a breath it felt as if she had stepped into another registry of being. The reflection showed her as she wished to be seen, stylized, composed, but behind that image the seam flattened into an insistence. Some forms prefer to be witnessed without transaction. She met people in the margins, an assistant from an onset who described seeing the seam as she exited through a service door. A night janitor who claimed, with the wry amusement of someone who keeps secrets untold, that sometimes things left backstage re-emerge with stories attached. These accounts, anecdotal in the public ledger, had the effect of thickening the possibility instead of resolving it. They were not evidence in the forensic sense, but they were not idle gossip either. They had the quality of witness. Small, precise, and uncomprehending in the way a person is uncomprehending when they see a stranger sitting in a temple. At moments, Celeste felt that the seam was less about passage and more about attendance. It did not swallow, it registered. It kept the shape of people who passed its threshold, as if jotting names in a book that would not be shown to the world. The idea held a kind of mercy, to be remembered without the contamination of spectacle. It was, in theory, a refuge. Yet that very privacy made her uneasy. What happens when a person is kept whole, but removed from any possibility of reclaiming the ledger? What price did such keeping demand? She began to dream of ledger books, pale folios whose pages turned with muffled sound, pages that recorded the precise tilt of a head, the cadence of laugh, the pattern of one's hands. In the dream, the ledger did not belong to her. It belonged to an anonymous registrar who sat in the seam and did not speak. The dreams were not violent, they were curiously administrational. The registrar's work was patient, an archivist's slow, meticulous attention. When she woke, she could remember the texture of the paper against her fingertips and the odd relief of being considered worthy of a record that was not public. Marlowe's account of the theater deepened this sense. He told her about a former actress who had liked being kept backstage because she hated the demand to perform her grief on stage and preferred to have it recorded in quiet. He did not romanticize the choice. "People make trades with attention," he said. "Sometimes you trade applause for not being exposed. You choose a ledger. There's nothing cosmic about it. It's practical, in a way." He watched her, as if measuring whether the idea made the tradesmanship of her career bearable. These conversations were not dramatic. They were not meant to be. They accumulated like sediment, the slow layering of small facts that eventually change the course of a river. Celeste's movement from curiosity to compulsion was not sudden, it was accrual. She found herself checking corners of frames she had never noticed, cataloguing the angles where light pooled, making lists of the days certain footage had been shot. She began to prefer the small private motion of observation to the public legerdemain of performance. She had, as well, an aesthetic reason to pursue the seam. Her work, no matter how much it was reduced in the popular press to the level of entertainment, had always been about the economy of attention. Celeste had built a career on the manipulation of gaze, where to look, when to look, the value of a look as currency. The seam presented a conceptual challenge to that currency, something that could not be monetized, that refused exchange, and yet asked not to be ignored. It was to her a provocation. The online conversations shifted as the footage diversified. A skeptical documentary maker posted a long-form thread dissecting the clip's pixels. An urban folklorist uploaded an essay about liminal figures in 20th century cities. Some broadcast outlets ran a feature that treated the seam as a local curiosity, a footnote in the roster of oddities the city offers to tourists. Each account attempted to place the seam in a known taxonomy: hoax, art piece, apparition. None of them read like the ledger Celeste was interested in. They read like attempts to register something that preferred not to be registered. There were also people who accused her of using the clip for attention. That accusation had an odd sting, given that she had spent the last months attempting to preserve the seam from consumption. They did not understand that she did not want to make content of the thing. She wanted to understand whether being kept was something she might choose. There was a cruelty in the suggestion that every unusual encounter with mystery must be converted into spectacle, as if people were incapable of maintaining a private ledger about the shape of their own lives without selling it. Her assistant, practical as ever, suggested she engage a publicist to control the narrative. "If the clip gains another wave, we spin it," the assistant said. "We release a curated piece, an essay, a short film. You'll decide the terms." Celeste closed the message without reply. The thought of staging it into an event felt like collapsing the seam into a set of poles she had to stand behind. She did not want to set up a lit stage in which the seam would perform for cameras. In the weeks that followed, the seam multiplied in rumor. Someone in a residential block began to speak of two figures standing between buildings at dawn, not moving, but somehow in conversation, if conversation can be that slow. A vintage shop owner found a cufflink in the pocket of a donated coat and thought to call it to Celeste's attention because the pattern matched a dress she had worn months earlier. None of these artifacts answered the question. They only narrowed the frame of inquiry, like a pair of hands bringing a model into focus. She began cataloging not for public consumption, but for her own structure. The notebook under her pillow gathered the raw materials of an investigation: observations, fragments, the names of witnesses, the timbre of voices. When she read them at night, she felt like an archivist cataloging a small, private institution. The pages were filled with stenographic phrases: amber seam, delivery cam 412, mirror ref, taxi 6th 3rd, and once in the margin a line that read simply, kept. The presence, the term itself, was slippery. She thought of it as less entity and more registry, began to feel like a ledger not of events, but of attentions. It did not confiscate memory so much as hold it. Once, in a late hour when the city's residual lights looked less like offerings than like fatigue, she imagined what it would mean to slip into that ledger, to choose privacy over applause, to trade the public chronicle for a private memory that would never be mined for content. She wondered whether anyone could come back from that sort of keeping, or whether the ledger, once it had your name, would be the place where a memory sat almost decently, like a well-placed coat on a peg. Her investigations drew the attention of certain small bulletin boards that offered long-form speculation. One academic wrote to say that threshold figures often function as social litmus tests. Do we value the visible life, or the life that is preserved without sale? Another correspondent, anonymous and meticulous, sent her a map of places where similar seams had been reported over decades. The map read like an index of absences. Each seam occurred where architecture folded, behind theaters, in narrow alleys, at joining walls where different eras of building met. There was no consensus. The city's appetite led to narratives that promised closure, but the seam refused to liquefy itself for the public palate. It did what it did. It kept. That word returned to her, like a bell she could not unring. When she returned to the theater again, it was not to cross but to watch. The rehearsal had emptied itself of performers. The stagehands moved with the quiet choreography of people who know how to be invisible. Celeste stood once more at the seam and allowed her eyes to adjust. The amber light felt deeper now, not merely pigment, but index. She waited to see whether the place would do anything visible, whether there would be a movement that could be broadcast and validated. Nothing of the sort occurred. What happened instead was a subtle rearrangement of her thoughts. The seam did not answer because it did not need to talk. It attended. Marlowe said little, which is often the way of people who have seen more than they've been asked to say. He handed her a paper cup of coffee and stood with the self-effacing stance of someone who had been tasked with keeping a secret he had not invented. "There was a young seamstress here once," he said after a long silence. "She would stitch ribbon into the curtains. She said that if you paid the building attention, it would pay you back. Folks laughed, of course. But then again, we've had things left backstage for years that didn't fit any explanation. A diary, a trumpet, an old photograph that belonged to no one alive. The building keeps things the way some people keep epigraphs. It remembers." Celeste thought of the ledger again. She touched the plaster, feeling the faint warmth at the seam's edge, as if the building had a pulse the city was too loud to hear. She had prepared herself for drama and found instead this, an administrative tenderness. To be kept, she realized, was to be addressed by attention that was not hungry but archival. When she finally turned to leave the wings that night, she noticed a scrap of fabric caught in a door hinge. A ribbon, the color of an old burnt postcard. She picked it up. It did not belong to anything she had seen on stage. It was not couture. It was simply a small human object that had been left in a private place. She folded it into her palm like a folding of possibility. The city's conversation continued without her. Threads argued about motivation. A video essayist suggested a psychological reading, that being an influencer was to live in performance to such an extent that the boundary between self and role was porous. Columnists wrote of the ethics of watching. Trolls suggested clever conspiracies. Celeste let the noise prickle at the edges of her life, without committing to any response. She preferred the slow accumulation of intimate record. At home, she rewound the original clip again and again, not for the sake of discovery, but as a way of keeping faith with the thing she could not yet name. The seam on the small screen had an austerity that never translated into sensationalism. It sat there, vertical and patient, as if it were a ledger page that refused to be photographed without losing the texture of the paper. That patience, more than anything, unsettled her. She had been taught to turn visibility into possibility, to convert attention into trajectory. The seam offered a different transaction, the possibility of being fully remembered without the world consuming the memory. To imagine accepting such a contract was to imagine a life parceled in a way she had never considered. A reader might ask, at this stage, whether her choice to investigate was an act of curiosity or an admission of fatigue. The truth settled somewhere between. Curiosity had always been her engine, but beneath it there was a quieter thing, a weariness with the predatory economy of attention. The seam proposed that someone might be allowed to be remembered without the performance of it. That suggestion had a melancholic appeal that felt like relief and threat at once. The theater's night air had a way of pulling a person into the sense of things that are made rather than found. Marlowe moved away to tend a rigging. Celeste lingered. She filed the images and fragments into neat piles in her mind, the way she had learned to file garments. She considered the seam with a kind of professional tenderness. How it looked on film, how it caught in reflections, how it might be coaxed into articulating something more. The seam did not condense into explanation. It merely invited the patient observation that was to her almost a form of devotion. As she stood there, hand resting on the plaster, an old theater door opened and let in a current of cooler air that smelled faintly of rain and iron. In that small gust, something shifted, a rearrangement of dust and light, and for half a breath she thought she perceived movement within the seam. It could have been her imagination. It could have been the city exhaling. Marlowe, who had been returning with a ladder, hesitated and then smiled with a private, conspiratorial fatigue. "It does that," he said. "It arranges itself when no one's looking." She did not know whether she would step through the seam. She did not know whether crossing would mean erasure or record. She had not made the choice, only circled the question like a careful animal. There remained in her a stubborn wish to be remembered for what she was, not what someone else could format her as. An insistence that, if memory were to be taken, it should be on terms she could own. Outside, the city kept talking. Inside, the theater kept its own hours, its own ledger, its own seam. The small square screen in her pocket felt like an ember she could either warm her hands on or throw away. She tucked the ribbon she had found into her palm and, for a moment, let the idea of being kept unhurriedly occupy her. The seam's amber light seemed less like threat and more like a private lamp left on in a long room, a place where things are counted without spectacle. If it were your feed, what would you do? Share your choice in the comments. When she left the theater that night, she did not close the question. She moved through the city's late lanes as though following a rumor that had not yet decided whether it wanted to be true. A reflection in a puddle held the seam like a coin at the bottom of a well. A storefront mirror carried it as a thin vertical in the glass. Sometimes at a crosswalk, she imagined the seam standing between the compressed planes of the sidewalk and the storefront, as if the city itself kept its memory in narrow gullets. There were practical reasons for delay. There were advisors, lawyers, managers, the assistant who quietly arranged her days, who insisted on rational responses. Secure the footage, release a statement, get a security check. Each small practicality felt like a counterweight to the private ledger she had imagined. Yet the seam made a claim that was not about legality or publicity. It asked for attention in a way that repelled monetization. At home, she arranged the things she had collected into a small improvised archive. She placed the gown's photograph beside the delivery cam stills. She put the ribbon on top, almost ceremonially, as if to mark the boundary between what she would offer and what she would hold. The act of arranging was, for her, a ritual of control. It was a way to say that she could choose which accounts of her life would be public and which would be private. The city summarized her story in blunt sentences. Social media summarized it in fragmentary jabs. She lived inside the accumulation of both, and yet There was a region of undecidedness that belonged only to her. The seam, with its patient amber light, continued to be a place where the city's appetite could not reach. It was a margin that refused to be flattened. She closed the folder with a slow hand and placed it on the nightstand. The phone in her pocket felt like a small glass tomb. She could plate the seam for public view and call it art or mystery. She could call a press conference and narrate the experience until it fit the rhythms of broadcast. Or she might, if the idea was not merely sentimental, walk into the seam and allow a different kind of ledger to begin. The notion was not romantic. It was administrative and intimate. It was a means of being preserved by attentiveness rather than consumed by visibility. At the threshold of sleep, she found herself counting not stars but seams. The theater seam, a seam in a mirror, a seam in a photograph. In the dark she rehearsed the small motions of being kept, hand placed on plaster. The feeling of being noted in a private book, a recording that would not be played for others. She imagined what it might mean to accept the trade. The abolition of the public ledger, the quieting of applause, the radical privacy of being remembered without audience. The morning after, the city offered new visuals, a blog rolling past with a headline that argued the clip was a hoax, an opinion piece that suggested she was engineering a narrative for attention, an amateur analyst who posted a theory that the seam was a lens flare under certain compression algorithms. None of it touched the quiet that had settled inside her. She carried that quiet like a secret talisman, and it altered the way she moved through the day. There was a sense, too, that the seam's logic was not limited to architecture. She saw in other places the pattern of keeping, a friend who folded away photographs of a marriage after it ended, a neighbor who kept a drawing in an envelope for years because it had once been significant. The human propensity to hold, rather than to display, suddenly seemed less eccentric and more adaptive, a culture's quieter morality. Her phone buzzed with the practicalities of life, an invitation to a morning show, a reminder for a fitting, a message from a stylist who wanted her to choose the look for an upcoming shoot. She replied with neutral politeness that disguised the fact that something had shifted. There was, she realized, an unglamorous courage in refusing the spotlight. The seam offered precisely such a refusal, but in a way that was not merely absence. It proposed an alternate grammar of existence where being known did not require being offered. That afternoon she returned to the theater on the pretext of an interview with a local arts magazine. The journalist, eager to frame an arc, asked all the predictable questions. Was it staged? What was the motive? Did she feel afraid? Celeste answered in ways that satisfied neither the journalist nor the city's appetite. She spoke instead about attention, about ledger and keeping, and about the strange relief of being permitted privacy. The photos that accompanied the piece were careful, portraits in shadow, a hand on plaster, a ribbon folded in the palm. The magazine's editor, practical in small ways, asked for a line that would work in a pull quote. She supplied one that was almost intentionally vague. Some things prefer to remember without being looked at. The line was used. It became a brief moment of coherence in a cloud of competing narratives. That evening she walked alone through the alleys that wrapped the theater. The seam had a rhythm that was not the city's rhythm. It matched the slow economy of people who kept ledgers. She moved toward it with a mixture of caution and calculation. There was a motion that felt like responsibility. The sense that if she were to choose keeping, she would be partly responsible for honoring that privacy, not abusing it, not turning it into spectacle. As the light dwindled and the theater's interior warmed with the afterlife of lamps, Celeste thought of ledger books, of quiet offices where a person sits and writes down names. She thought of Marlowe and the way he spoke about objects and the building's capacity to preserve. She thought of the librarian with her mimeographed pages and the way she had smiled as if the question itself was more valuable than an answer. At the edge of the wings, she paused. The amber seam sat like an unlit cigarette, a small, suggestive shape that offered a choice without pressing it. Behind it, the corridor went on. Beyond that lay the city's gut and the private registry of whatever kept records there. Celeste felt the familiar pressure of cameras everywhere, the implicit demand to decide quickly, to convert indefiniteness into digestible content. She had always resisted such demands. But there came a sharper pressure now, not about being seen by many, but about being recorded in a different way. She folded the ribbon into her knuckles and felt the texture of its weave. The seam did not interrupt her intention, it only awaited it. The theater breathed as though in a different climate. Somewhere deep in the building, a prop that had been adored and set aside made a small sound as if acknowledging her deliberation. She did not move forward then. She stepped back into the wings, keeping the night's hush like a promise between her and the building. There was time. The next step came in a season of small permissions. She returned to the wings, not as a stunt, but as a practiced entering. Shoes chosen for silence, coat folded, hands empty, except for the ribbon in her palm. The building received her with the same indifferent hospitality it showed to all who had business within it. Shadowed corridors, the faint granular light of an emergency exit, the distant clack of a door closing somewhere a level down. Marlowe met her at a side passage with a flashlight that showed his face like a low-relief carving. He did not ask for speeches. He offered the practicalities he knew, where the seams ran truest, where the bulbs had the old amber cast, which doors had locks that never quite latched. "We do this without fanfare," he said, and the sentence was a covenant, not an instruction. He led without theatricality, the route a choreography of someone whose life had been defined by entrances and exits that must not be noticed. They moved through the building's ribs to a place that had fewer visitors than most city alleys. The seam was narrower tonight. The plaster had a thin, almost surgical smell of lime and older paint. The lamp that lent the amber a resinous hue was out of direct view, so the light felt as if it was being metered by the building itself, an attention that decided how much would be allowed. Celeste said nothing. She had rehearsed the motion in quieter rooms, in the notebook under her pillow, in the unspoken ledger of decision. Each rehearsal had been a stripping away of spectacle. This was not a performance for audience, nor an act of escape into melodrama. It was a deliberate trade, an agreement she intended to make with a way of being that kept rather than consumed. Marlowe stood a small distance off, an able witness whose role was practical evidence if any were asked for later. He would have a story, delicate, precise, the sort of report you give when you have seen something you cannot fully translate into the day's language. He had been asked before why he stayed in a building that seemed to hoard eccentricity. His answer always returned to the work. Things happen there that matter to people, even when the city insists they be turned into narratives. As Celeste approached the seam, she noticed how the amber light pooled differently depending on the slightest tilt of her head. It arranged itself like a memory settling into a page. She pressed her hand to the plaster and felt warmth, less like heat than like a stored scent. Her breath was a small, steady thing. The theater's sounds, rail movements, an occasional far-off laugh, receded into the distance like actors who had been asked to stop applauding. The presence did not announce itself with fanfare. There was no voice, no sudden gust or rearrangement of the world. Instead there came, with the economy of a ledger entry, a sensation of being noted. It pressed the way a name is pressed into paper, an imprint, not an erasure. Celeste perceived with the blunt clarity that sometimes arrives after prolonged thought the nature of the offer, to be kept. It did not want performance. It asked merely to register the shape of her, to catalogue her hand's curve, the rhythm of her laugh, the peculiar angle of her shoulder in profile. She did not imagine that stepping forward would be like stepping into a dream. The motion was small, precise, exactly her size. She moved through the seam with the decisiveness of someone closing a book she had been reading carefully for years. The amber light softened over her skin. There was a sensation, not visionary, not fantastical, that something met the back of her head like a hand laying down a book on a table. It was administrative, patient, less a funeral than an archive being opened. Marlowe watched from his place by the ladder. His hands, which had tied rigging and steadied curtains, were folded at his waist. He had expected perhaps a visible flash, an after-image, or at least the obvious thread of a performance. Instead, his memory would hold the quieter knot. Celeste stepping forward, the seam closing like the closing of a folder. For a moment, he thought he felt the weight of a page turning in the air. He could not later produce more than that. An impression of motion, and then a settled stillness where movement had been. There was a camera, as there had been almost always now, because her life was knitted to that possibility. She had asked Marlowe to leave a small phone on a low tripod at a respectful distance, not to document for spectacle, but simply to keep a record of action in the most neutral sense. The device captured a vertical slice. The seam, the amber band, a hand moving. The footage did not dramatize. It recorded a measured incision of light, and then an absence. On the small frame, the seam's grain continued for a beat longer than was comfortable, and then the feed reduced itself to a homely, unremarkable blankness. The sort of blankness you get when the camera's angle is suddenly occupied by a wall. There was no sweeping vanishing, no trace of bodies dissolving. There was the measured pause of a thing that had accepted an enrollment. If anyone expected a cinematic reveal, the footage refused to oblige. Audiences who had become accustomed to dramatic resolution might interpret blankness as clever staging. Critics would argue about compression artifacts and framing. The raw file, saved to a folder and duplicated 3 times in different formats, looked like an ordinary failure of angle. Yet to Celeste, who had felt the press of that record into her, the clipping of time was a different sort of evidence. Not proof of disappearance in forensic terms, but proof of a choice being witnessed. Afterwards, Marlowe moved slowly, as if learning to carry weight he could not set down. He found a ribbon behind a hinge that matched the one Celeste had kept in her palm. He picked it up with a care that treated it like an artifact, like the minimal remains of a small ritual. He placed it in his pocket. When he later spoke about the night, he would say, without dramatizing, that Celeste had seemed resolutely calm, and that a quietness had settled in the corridor as if some clerk had finished writing. The city reacted in the ways a city does. The feed, planted, then quietly altered by the presence of blankness, entered other people's machinery. Headlines proposed motives, each louder than the next. A legal column argued about liability. A gossip site insinuated publicity stunts. The skeptics circulated the tripod footage and pointed at the frame where the seam turned into wall. Someone on a critical forum wrote about the politics of visibility. Someone else posted a thread about how the camera had been placed slightly off-center. In comment sections, people performed the economies of ownership they had learned. We will name this. We will render it tidy. We will turn it into content. But the city could not quite settle the ledger. The evidence that mattered to Celeste and the building, the gentle archive of a life's contours, was not legible in the formats the city preferred. That did not keep rumor from flourishing. It only meant rumor became another thing to be metered against the private ledger she had chosen. Small traces surfaced in ways that did not obey the public's appetite for spectacle. Weeks later, a sales clerk in an unrelated borough found, at the bottom of a box of donations, a gown that had once been worn by someone who moved through rooms as Celeste had. The fabric bore a faint, unidentifiable press, no stain that a camera could easily name, only an impression. A poetry book returned to a library from a long-circulated lending pile contained a slip of paper, folded small. Inside it, in a handwriting that might have been hers, or might not, the single word, "kept," was written. A doorman who had earlier claimed to see someone hurry away from a service door now said, with the weary restraint of a man who had seen too many patterns bend, that at dawn he had noticed two silhouettes like bookends between buildings, at the same time, staying still long enough to be wondered at. The footage that had once been the seed of investigation, sad in its old phone grain, patient in its amber light, now multiplied into other, softer records. An amateur photographer captured a